Greetings, fellow readers and story lovers, and welcome back to my channel, where we are steadily making our way through William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Currently, we are talking about Act 2, Scene 2, the famous balcony scene. So let's dive straight back on in, shall we? So, as always, let's start with a little bit of a recap. In last week's video, I talked quite extensively about Act Two's prologue, why it's there, what it tells us, and how it changes the audience's perception of the play. The long and short of it is, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy, but the first two acts almost function like a romance story. So the two prologues, one before Act 1 and the other before Act 2, act as reminders to the audience that they're watching a tragedy and that they shouldn't get too invested in the romance story. Act Two's prologue also functions as a quick summary of the first act. It reminds the audience that Romeo has fallen out of love with Rosalind and in love with Juliet, and that their love is quite dangerous because of their family's hatred of each other. And lastly, like the first prologue, Act Two's prologue is delivered by a chorus, which adds a layer of formality and authority to it. That means that in addition to being told what has happened, the audience is also being told how to interpret what has happened. And that makes the audience complicit in the tragic outcome of the play. For a more detailed analysis on this, see the previous video, which is linked in the description, and there should be a card appearing somewhere above my head right now. Also, in the last video, we started talking about the beginning of Act 2, Scene 2, the first 9 lines specifically, which is where Romeo is still completely alone in the Capulet orchard. In these lines, Romeo talks quite explicitly about his sexual desire for Juliet. He says that he wants her to kill the envious moon and cast off her vestal livery. Now, the moon is a reference to the Roman goddess Diana, who was seen as the protectress of virgins, and vestal livery refers to virginal clothing. So, Romeo is essentially asking Juliet to cut ties with the goddess of virginity and take off the clothes that mark her as a virgin. In short, he wants Juliet to sleep with him. At the same time, Romeo also calls Juliet the sun and fair sun in lines 2 and 3, respectively. On the surface level, this continues the same imagery. Sun and moon are natural opposites, so replacing the moon with the sun symbolically replaces chastity with desire. But there's also a quiet layer of irony here. Sunrise symbolizes hope, the beginning of a new day. Yet for Romeo and Juliet, daylight is dangerous. Night is what protects them because it's what allows their relationship to stay hidden. So by calling Juliet the sun, Romeo unknowingly wishes away the very darkness that keeps them safe. And that idea isn't going anywhere. We'll see the same night versus day symbolism crop up in the next part of the scene. So let's take a look at that, shall we? Now, like I said, in the first 9 lines of the scene, Romeo is alone in the Capulet orchard. But then Juliet appears above at the window, and from that moment on, Romeo's language changes quite dramatically. It becomes much more poetic and much more romantic, too. In lines 10 to 23, he leans heavily into star imagery. Listen to this. Two of the fairest stars in all the heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness of her cheeks would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. Her eyes in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. Those are lines 15 to 22, in case you're wondering. Now, what is it that he's actually saying here behind all the waxing poetry? Essentially, Romeo claims that Juliet's eyes are so bright they could switch places with two of the brightest stars in heaven, and her cheeks would still outshine those stars. Now, that is some seriously exaggerated imagery, don't you think? Well, that's entirely intentional. Shakespeare is drawing on a poetic tradition known as Petrarchan blazon. Not quite sure I'm pronouncing that right, so forgive me if I'm butchering it. English is not my native language, by the way. What Romeo is doing is he's listing Juliet's physical features, her eyes and her cheeks, and describing them in exaggerated, almost impossible comparisons. You've almost certainly heard modern versions of this. Think of lines like, her eyes shine like sapphires, or her lips are ruby red. Same tradition, different cloak. Romeo is doing the same thing when describing Juliet. And this exaggeration tells us something important. Romeo doesn't really see Juliet as a person yet. He idealizes her. She's an idea, a vision, almost a celestial object, beautiful, distant, and slightly unreal. There's also something quietly ironic here. Again, Shakespeare's a big fan of that. Because Romeo says that her eyes stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. Once again, he wishes the night away. But night is their safety. I touched on this in the last video and in the recap section, but Romeo can only be in the Capulet orchard because it is nighttime. That's why he's not being discovered. And, we all know what Tybalt would do if he saw Romeo there. He's not been shy about it. So, even in this moment of romance, his desire symbolically wishes the very thing away that's keeping them safe. Without realizing it, Romeo's love pushes them toward danger. Moving on to lines 23 to 25. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand? Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. This is surprisingly gentle, especially compared to his earlier words, where his desire was much more explicit. He openly admitted to wanting to sleep with Juliet. Here, Romeo doesn't even wish to touch Juliet directly. He wishes to be something that is allowed to touch her, namely a glove. The desire is still there. Clearly, he still longs to be close to her, but now it's filtered through poetry and imagination. He idealizes closeness almost as much as he idealizes Juliet herself, partly because he has no real experience with love yet. Interestingly, the line, see how she leans her cheek upon her hand, almost functions as stage direction. Juliet has to be standing at the window, resting her cheek on her hand. Otherwise, this line would make no sense on stage. And I already mentioned this in a video before that Shakespeare does like doing that occasionally, using dialogue as stage direction. Moving on to the next few lines, where Romeo's pattern of idealization continues. But the imagery shifts from celestial to religious. Juliet briefly speaks, just, I me. And yes, that sigh is technically my interpretation, but I dare you to say those words without sighing. And Romeo immediately responds, oh, speak again, bright angel, for thou art as glorious to this night, being over my head, as a winged messenger of heaven unto the white upturned wondering eyes of mortals that fall back to gaze on him, when he bestrides the lazy passing clouds and sails upon the bosom of the air. In this section, Romeo continuously compares her to an angel, or as he puts it, a winged messenger of heaven. He literally calls her a divine figure of heaven, while he, the mortal, looks up at her in awe. Now, on a literal level, that's exactly what the audience sees. Romeo is below in the orchard, while Juliet is above him at the window, so he physically has to look up to her. But symbolically, By the way, the difference between a symbol and a metaphor is that a symbol works on both the literal and the figurative level, while a metaphor only works on the figurative one. So, symbolically, this places Romeo in the position of worshipper rather than equal partner. This echoes the imagery from their shared sonnet in Act 1, Scene 5, where Romeo casts himself as pilgrim and Juliet in the role of a saint. Same dynamic. Romeo continuously elevates her into something sacred, something above him, something not quite human. She becomes heavenly, beautiful, yes, but also unreachable. Angels belong in heaven, they do not belong on earth. And by placing Juliet in this heavenly sphere, he turns their relationship into something that struggles to exist in the real world. His poetry makes their love sound transcendent and romantic, but Shakespeare suggests danger in that idea, because their love is already moving toward the inevitable tragedy. And there's something quietly heartbreaking about that idea, isn't there? Now, up until now, Romeo has been doing most of the talking. Juliet has had the one line I've already mentioned and doesn't even know that Romeo is there yet. That doesn't change, by the way. She gets through the entire soliloquy we're about to talk about without ever noticing him. And that creates another moment of dramatic irony. Shakespeare really likes putting those in his plays, doesn't he? Because the audience knows Romeo is listening to her, but Juliet does not. She thinks she's speaking only to herself, or perhaps to the knight. And that changes how we understand her words. It's not flirtation or performance. She's not trying to impress Romeo because she doesn't even know he's there. These are her private thoughts and her genuine reasoning. And the audience gets to understand that in a way that even Romeo doesn't. We get to hear her think out loud, completely unfiltered, and get to see how she sees the situation between her and Romeo. Let's take a look at what she says, shall we? O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. 'Tis but thy name that is my enemy. Thou art thyself, though not a Montague. What's a Montague? It is nor hand nor foot, nor arm nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man. Oh, be some other name. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes, without that title. Romeo, doff thy name, and for thy name, which is no part of thee, take all myself. Now, first things first, let's get a common misunderstanding out of the way. Wherefore doesn't mean where, it means why. Juliet isn't asking, oh, Romeo, where are you? She's asking, why do you have to be Romeo? Or, more specifically, why do you have to be a Montague? This is also emphasized by the fact that she keeps repeating words like name, Romeo, and Montague throughout this soliloquy. She has recognized something that Romeo just hasn't yet, namely that their biggest problem isn't distance or fate or even secrecy, it's their identities. If she weren't a Capulet and Romeo weren't a Montague, then they could be together, no problem. There would be no feud, no danger, no tragedy. They would simply be allowed to love each other and be happy. But of course, they are a Capulet and a Montague. That's the entire problem. So Juliet begins to imagine a solution. Deny thy father and refuse thy name. In other words, abandon your family so that you can be with me instead. And then she immediately goes even further than that. She says, or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. She is willing to give up her own name in order to be with Romeo. And I don't think a modern audience necessarily realizes just how radical this would have sounded to an Elizabethan audience. In Shakespeare's time, family was everything, especially for a young woman of noble status like Juliet. Family is the thing that gives her status, protection, security. It determines her social standing, her marriage prospects, everything. Without her family name, Juliet has nothing to fall back on. She would be a social outcast. And yet, only hours after meeting Romeo and sharing only one dance and a conversation with him, she is willing to give it all up for him. She is willing to imagine a world in which identity isn't something that is imposed upon her, but that she can choose for herself, which is a remarkably radical idea for the time period. And for Shakespeare to put those words into the mouth of a female character is quite radical too. Just saying. And with that, we come to the philosophical heart of her speech. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. She's saying that a name doesn't define a person, doesn't determine who that person is on the inside. Romeo would still be Romeo even if he weren't called that, and she would still feel for him the way she does now. Names, she argues, are merely social constructs. And you know what? She's not wrong. But even though Juliet understands that names are arbitrary and ultimately meaningless, she is still trapped by hers. Because the society that she lives in puts stock and value by her name, and she cannot escape that. And therein lies one of the quiet tragedies of the scene. One other thing I'd like to mention, she calls Romeo's qualities that dear perfection which he owes, meaning she's already quite infatuated with him and idealizes him too. Romeo's idealization of her may be a bit more on the nose and over the top, but Juliet isn't quite as rational as she might seem either. She's also just a young woman in love, which to me just means that they're quite perfect for each other. And then we get to the emotional climax. Romeo, doff thy name, and for thy name, which is no part of thee, take all myself. She proposes an exchange, your name for my love. If you give up your name, then we can be together. Which almost makes love seem a little transactional again. Remember how I pointed out in the prologue of Act 2 that love is treated like something that is inherited? Here, it almost sounds like love can be traded for something else, like their love can replace their social identities. And here's where we begin to see the clearest difference between their approaches to love. Romeo idealizes Juliet, lifts her up into the heavens, makes her something otherworldly, like an angel. Juliet brings love down to earth. She recognizes that their problem isn't just fate and stars, though it certainly is that too, but society, the structures that govern their lives and tie them to their respective families. Where Romeo tries to escape reality, she tries to reimagine it, tries to reshape it so that their love becomes possible. Unfortunately, however, neither of those approaches work, and that's the tragedy of it. Their feelings may be genuine and reciprocated, but they were just not meant for the world that they live in. And Shakespeare shows us this within one of the most romantic scenes in this play, which is quietly brilliant, in my opinion. So, what does this part of the scene ultimately show us? Well, in these two speeches, Shakespeare reveals that these two characters understand love in completely different ways. Romeo looks at Juliet and lifts her up into the heavens. Through stars, angels, and religious imagery, he turns love into something transcendent and otherworldly, something that exists above ordinary reality. Juliet, on the other hand, brings love back down to earth. She understands the practical nature of their situation, that their main obstacle lies not in fate or distance or secrecy, but in something far more concrete: their identities. The names that define who society believes them to be and which they simply cannot escape. Interestingly, both of them are right in their own ways. Their love is shaped by fate. Act 1 has made that clear, but it is also constrained by society. The tragedy of Romeo and Juliet doesn't come from just one of these forces, but from both of them combined. Romeo tries to escape reality by idealizing love. Juliet tries to reshape reality by redefining identity in order to make their love possible. Neither works because Verona doesn't allow it to. They cannot escape their fate, but they also cannot escape who they are. And that's what makes this scene so powerful. On the surface, it's one of the most romantic moments in the entire play, and that's certainly what it's most remembered for. But underneath the poetry and the passion, Shakespeare is already showing us why this love cannot survive the world it exists in. The romance feels hopeful, almost like the dawn of a new day, but in Romeo and Juliet, daylight is dangerous. And so the tragedy is already creeping in. And soon enough, reality will come crashing down around them. And that's exactly what we'll be looking at in next week's video, when Romeo and Juliet finally get to talk to each other and their fantasy starts colliding with the world around them. For now, this is me signing off. Again. That does not work. Is a did I say philosophical right? Hang on, did I actually put? Yeah, okay. For a moment, I was kind of like, I don't remember saying that. I don't go into any more detail about that. Was that intentional? Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, share, and comment down below. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you don't want to miss any of my future videos. I also have a Patreon that you can subscribe to, starting at as little as $2 a month, which gives you early access to any of my videos. Higher tiers include access to exclusive Patreon-only content and the chance to suggest books, plays, or poems for any future analysis. For now, that is it from me, and I'll see you next time.